Gray wanted nothing more than be able to have physical evidence to be able to present to the public. He really wanted that with a passion.
In the mid-50s, after he began to publish, he was gradually putting together material for a book. And his book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, is, I suppose, the origin, really, for the paranoid theory of UFO.
I think some of Gray's early coverage of the UFO field is probably some of the best reporting on what was actually happening to people all over the country.
This is a case where maybe even exorcism can't help.
There are no such things as flying saucers. The government has told you that. If you believe President Eisenhower and government announcements, you need have no fear of being frightened by this story.
He got started in this in 1952. There was this thing quite near his hometown in West Virginia, Flatwoods.
Something was seen in the sky. Maybe it was a meteor, maybe it was a spacecraft. Some people who saw it went up on the hillside. Perhaps a meteor landed, and at any rate, there was mist, there was smoke, there was an odd odor. Maybe there was someone standing at the eaves of the forest at the edge of the clearing with red eyes.
At the time, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Pittsburgh Press, all the newspapers came to Flatwoods to do stories on this sighting.
Barker, who had aspirations to be a writer, thought this would be a great story to tell. So he went and interviewed the witnesses and, did the usual things. And then he published the story in a 1953 issue of Fate magazine, which was an occult paranormal digest that was widely read at the time.
Gray went down and just saw this connection. Not only was it UFOs, which were quite topical at the time, flying saucers they were called then, but the monster angle. And I think through some of his horror films that he was such a fan of as a young man, I think it just struck a chord, that particular case.
You see, Gray Barker had grown up in Flatwoods, and he was fascinated with what had happened there. And of course, Gray Barker was an amateur UFOologist. In fact, he says in Fate magazine and later in interviews, this incident, because he knew Flatwoods so well, really ignited his great interest in, of course, flying saucers.
Put yourself into the shoes of a housewife, a teenager, or a 10-year-old boy, and walk over a hilltop into the unknown. Into an experience so alien and awesome, your body freezes. Cold shock overcomes you, and you later vomit for hours.
I had read about some of these outstanding cases that began really in 1947. There was a man named Kenneth Arnold who saw 9 gleaming objects over Mount Rainier in Washington State while he was flying his private plane. Just a couple of weeks later, maybe less than 2 weeks, came the Roswell incident. And you certainly have heard of the Roswell incident because that goes on and on. But the Arnold thing began what is now known as the modern flying saucer era.
Remember, at the beginning, no one thought they might be from outer space. Certainly people had been seeing these things before Kenneth Arnold. But it was the Arnold sighting that got nationwide attention, I think, for the first time. And yeah, once it became clear that this wasn't anything the Russians were doing and wasn't anything we were doing, yeah, then we were launched into the interplanetary.
In the 50s, we were fascinated with the heavens, weren't we? We really were. You began to see movies come out. You began to see terms like flying saucer coined. Then other movies developed. Then Fate magazine and Saucerian, the magazine that Gray Barker edited and printed. There were these ufology groups cropping up. It was popular culture.
Starting in about 1950, people began organizing little UFO groups. And one of the first was the International Flying Saucer Bureau, which was headquartered in Bridgeport, Connecticut. It was headed by a guy named Al Bender.
Well, he started out by having one of the early flying saucer magazines. It was a little quarterly thing called Space Review, I think. And just ordinary stuff, sightings and all that.
Barker heard about this organization and contacted Bender, and soon Barker was the head of investigations for the group. They actually did collect data. They interviewed people. They tried to separate, seemingly authentic sightings from mistakes and hoaxes. There were a lot of these little organizations back in the 50s. They would not be remembered as the International Flying Saucer Bureau is remembered, if not for Barker's association with it and the way the organization came to an end.
Bender's last issue contained a number of what seemed to be veiled statements referring to his silencing.
Bender claimed that 3 men in black suits early in the fall of 1953 had visited him, told him the frightening answer to the UFO riddle, and caused him, out of fear and trauma, to shut down the organization and to leave the UFO field entirely.
Barker took this story, Veiled Warnings, no longer a mystery, and he created the story of the 3 men, the men in black, who came to Mr. Bender and silenced him.
So in 1956, he published a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers.
They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers actually spooked me when I read it, because he gives account after account of people who have had experiences.
3 men in black suits with threatening expressions on their faces. 3 men who walk in on you and make certain demands. 3 men who know that you know what the saucers really are. They don't want you to tell anyone else what you know.
He has an underlying hint that men in black exist. Be careful. If you know too much and you dare to tell it, you will be visited.
I really think it was a genius stroke for him to turn that story into that manuscript and to submit it to University Press, where it became a bestseller for several weeks on the national charts.
Gray invites the reader to work with him on solving the mystery, that you may have the insight, the association that cracks the whole thing open. Now, how can you resist an invitation like that?
I'm going to say something blasphemous here. The Barker has written one of the Gospels, and the Gospels have points in common and they have points that differ. And gradually the UFO message has incorporated elements of all of them, and it becomes a sort of popular, some people want to say, counter-religion.
He was his own publisher, his own distributor, his own writer. He did it all. And he did so many different things, and people would trust him, and they wouldn't trust other people. And like with the Philadelphia experiment, and write to him.
Morris K. Jessup was a guy who actually had a genuine scientific education. He had a master's degree in astronomy from the University of Michigan.
On Friday, January 13th, 1956, Jessup received a letter from Carlos Miguel Allende, also signing his name as Carl M. Allen. In brief, the letters tell of an unorthodox experiment carried out by the Navy, which worked, but with most terrifying results.
Carlos Allen, or Allende, take your pick, was the contact who got in touch with Jessup and who gradually convinced Jessup that there was something to this whole case back in 1943 in the Philadelphia Naval Yard and Norfolk Naval Yard about this destroyer that was made invisible.
Just who was Carlos Miguel Allende? Why did Jessup take such a great interest in the strange letters? Where is Allende now? Or is there such a person? It seems that those who knew too much were soon disposed of. Did Jessup also know too much?
Carlos Alendez, or what, that's the name he gave. It was probably an alias. But when he wrote to Gray, and they told him he was on that ship, and he wrote all this information down, and Gray put it into a book.
At 6:30 p.m. on April 20th, 1959, the body of Dr. M.K. Jessup, astronomer, researcher, and writer on the subject of flying saucers, was found in his station wagon in a park near Coral Gables, Florida. Medical examiners labeled the death suicide.
After They Knew Too Much came out in '56, there was this tremendous interest in the field about these cases, the hush-up cases, Gray used to call them. And this was indeed the case with the Jessup affair, because supposedly he got involved and knew too much.
Wherever people went, if Mothman was flying around wilderness areas, they're more likely to see them here.
In November of '66, November 15th, 1966, here in Point Pleasant, you had two young couples who were on the outskirts of Point Pleasant near what they call the TNT area. They were chased back into town by this bird or creature or whatever. It's never been proven what it was or anything, but it did scare them pretty bad. So obviously they went to the law officials, the sheriff's department here in Mason County. They kind of scoffed at that idea. But then within the next year and a half, you had probably another 100 reported sightings of the same thing.
The dog was sitting on the end of the porch, howling down towards the hay barn in the bottom. Mr. Partridge shined his light in that direction, and it picked up two red circles, or eyes which looked like bicycle reflectors. Almost at the same moment, the light from the flashlight reflected in the eyes. Bandit charged, violently, but silently.
They had seen the dead German Shepherd alongside the road on the way into town. And on the way back out of town, the dog was gone. And there's some speculation that it was the same dog that Morrill Partridge disappeared from his farm. The dog's name was Bandit.
Okay, when they first saw it, they were coming from that direction towards us. And he saw Mothman alongside of the road, and he walked over towards the North Power Plant. In some accounts, Linda Scarberry said that his wing was stuck on a fence or something, and he pulled it loose. Then he went over to where the power plant was, which was right on the other side of this fence, over in here. We spent a great deal of time at the Clarksburg Library in the Gray Barker collection, and there's hundreds of files, and there's a good-sized file on letters shared with John Keel.
The two of them developed a relationship which eventually culminated in the possibility that they would collaborate on a Mothman book, which never came to pass. Keel wrote that book on his own, and Gray wrote his own book.
His investigation was totally separate than John Keel's, so it gave another viewpoint. And, those viewpoints are very hard to find because, he was there when it happened. He talked to some of those original witnesses 40 years ago when all this was going on.
He was very, very proud of that book. That was his masterwork.
Well, some people thought that there may have been a connection between all the Mothman UFO activity and the Silver Bridge collapse because they happened in such a close proximity to each other.
The rumbling grew louder. He saw two people abandon their cars and run down off the incline. A great silence. The two great bridge abutments stood like mute giants in the middle of the river as the muddy waters whirled around them. If somebody or some agency was after me, they have failed, for I have survived. I sincerely believe there have been other efforts to silence me, and these matters I will tell about someday.
Gray wanted nothing more than to be able to have physical evidence, to be able to present to the public. He really wanted that with a passion, but he could never really, it was almost just like getting close, but you could never actually get a hold of it. He would have liked to be able to have that. He told me a couple times, he said, I would really like to be able to meet some of this at one time. I says, well, Gray, maybe not in this life, but maybe in your next life.
Yeah, you know, it's a long time ago. I was very sad when he died. Although he sort of went downhill in his last years. He wasn't enjoying life as much, and his finances were going downhill, and I think his health was getting worse. And he died in December of 1984.
He was chasing a dream all his life. I could see that. And he finally found it after he passed on to the other side. When I went, we had the open coffin, and I went to the funeral. I mean, I've seen a lot of people in coffins in a funeral parlor, but I never saw one smile. He had a smile on his face. It almost as if he was telling me finally he got what he was looking for. He finally found, excuse me, what he was looking for. And I'm happy for him. Whenever I try to talk to Gray about his personal beliefs, he'd make a good politician. He always steered you away into something else. He never would give me his personal opinion about anything.
This is the room that we devoted to Gray Barker's books and papers. It's an archive. It's a research room. The principal part of the collection is Barker's files. It's not duplicated anywhere.
There were 7 file cabinets full of letters from all over the world of anybody who had ever remotely seen a flying saucer, and 1 file folder full of card-carrying aliens.
The files include some rare publications, but mostly Barker's correspondence with others in the UFO field. Some of them amateurs who subscribed to his publications and then contributed their own UFO or other paranormal stories. And that correspondence was a source that Barker used in his own writing.
Every year we get numerous requests from people all around the world wanting to know about Gray Barker. Well, I would just, by mutual consent with him, give them his telephone number because he could talk with them better than I could. And other people some people would come to the library. Summer times we'd get several visitors. This one man said, I'm looking for Gray Barker. He said, every time I find someone who believes in the Middle Earth theory, they're as crazy as hell, and I wonder if he is too. So I said, well, here's his number. You go find out.
Some little fraction of the people who come to the room are the people who would have come to Barker himself. That is, they think the earth is hollow and people live in it. and they want to know what evidence we can provide, or they want to know about UFOs, or they want to... The Braxton County Monster of 1952 is still a hot item.
As this is written, UFOs have become more respectable among academics, and many scientists are openly discussing their possible reality. We at Saucer News were excited when we received some correspondence from Dr. Richard H. Pratt. I was never certain of his true identity, but the fact that whoever Dr. Pratt actually was, the real person, evidently disappeared. I have no evidence that Pratt was silenced or carted off by the MIB.
Who is Richard Pratt? Richard H. Pratt, Dr. Richard H. Pratt, is me, John C. Sherwood. I think that the sci-fi story you are thinking of, revealing at the end that it's made up, would be a little too negative. Already some readers are accusing us of making up things, parentheses, which we do occasionally, of course. Richard Pratt was essentially a character that became larger than life for me. I've been living with this guy now for more than 30 years, it seems, 40 years now, I think. It's a kind of an albatross around my neck, but at the same time I'm glad to talk about it because I want people to understand that this is tied up with the whole Men in Black and Mothman notions that Gray helped to foster back in the 60s.
We work for a highly funded yet unofficial government agency.
In the latter part of the 1990s, when the first Men in Black movie came out, this was long after Gray had died, I was sitting there in the theater with my wife thinking, watching the trailer for Men in Black, suddenly startled to see one of Gray's pet projects suddenly turning into a film. I realized I needed to step forward and say something about what I knew about Gray Barker, who had been behind much of the first popularization of the Men in Black myth. We do need a science editor. This is addressed to John, of course. We do need a science editor, but how about using Pratt's title, Doctor, in the credit? So there you have it. I'm in charge of Dr. Richard H. Pratt. And this letter is addressed to the creature from the Black Lagoon, namely me, in 1969. We've had a great deal of controversy about other things in the current ish, but nothing at all about Dr. Pratt's time travel. Evidently, the fans swallowed this one with a gulp. It's always nice to hear from you, Gray. When you're doing wrong, it's got to be set straight. And the truth behind the matter is, I helped Gray Barker tell lies.
First of all, ufology is already a fringe field, but he was on the fringe of the fringe. The people who had a more kind of disciplined outlook on the question before them saw Barker as a guy who was not reliable, who was a liar, a hoaxer, who was promoting all kinds of bizarre stuff that was just plain embarrassing to the more serious investigators.
He was happy to take other people's delusions and encourage them by having them write a book for him or editing the book that they did write and having it come out as truth.
He published a book by a woman who had spent years investigating the quote-unquote mysterious death of Morris Jessup. And she believed that she was guided by literally the spirit of Morris Jessup, who wanted the truth about his murder exposed.
His posthumous relationship with Morris Jessup was to promote the idea that Jessup had been killed in order to silence him, when Jessup simply despaired and gassed himself in his automobile. So it's sort of like after they're dead, you can eat them. I mean, he treated Morris Jessup with friendship and respect during his lifetime, and then after he died, he promoted the idea that Jessup was a victim of the Men in Black.
On the fringes, nobody dies a sad, ordinary, tragic death. They're all mysterious deaths. So the legends began that somehow Jessup had found some great secret, and the U.S. government had him murdered for that.
The people that Barker dealt with were, to some extent, there for him to exploit. Their stories were there for him to exploit in his writing. And if their stories needed to be modified for the sake of exploitation, he could do that too.
The triad of Barker, Jessup, and Allen, who it seems to me, so it's really one story. Well, there's a part of me that says, okay, these are three losers who want to do great things, but don't have the background or the equipment or the opportunity. Then the other part of me says, well, heck, how does that make them different from any of the rest of us? I mean, we're all losers. And they may illuminate for us our own failures, our own longings, our own attempts to transcend the longings.
I'd like for you to sort of keep an eye on the persons around you, because the last time I was here at Witness 2 years ago and spoke, a gentleman fell asleep and fell off of his chair and injured his arm.
He had that really wry sense of humor. Claimed that he actually caught up with two of the men in black. And part of the lore was that the men in black not only dressed in these somber outfits, but also drove old automobiles that looked like new. Gray started to chase this while he was filming. I'm going to catch them. There they are. These are the men in black. We saw them back here, and they were harassing witnesses. So he's chasing this car, and this car is trying to get away from Gray because he's driving like a madman. And it turns out, and Gray admitted later, that wasn't in the film, that it was an old farm couple.
This first sequence is the Lost Creek saucer, and we will see a boy pointing toward the sky, and finally we will see an object sort of dancing around in the sky. The object is sort of swaying like a falling leaf motion. Its main motion is by the camera itself, because these people were understandingly nervous.
We got a little model saucer, maybe 6 inches in diameter, a child's toy, on the end of a thin string.
This is the Barker Curio cabinet. Photographs and things mostly. But also, right out in plain sight, the Barker bogies. I don't know if bogey's still a current word in UFO, but of course bogey short for bogus. And these are Barker bogus saucers, and they're the George Adamski style saucer. There it is with its pods,
Jim Moseley has used this particular film during the time that he was on lecture tours, and this was very well received.
It took 3 people. I drove, and a kid that Gray knew was on the roof dangling this thing out the window. Then Gray Barker was filming it.
Oddly enough, hoaxing is part of UFO. It's part of the performance of UFO is to create and distribute frauds. And it doesn't mean that you don't believe in the genuineness of the underlying phenomenon. You just accept that somehow the creation and distribution of frauds is part of it. Jim Moseley says that Barker used to sit back and calmly say, it's all part of the pattern.
So it's just only natural, I suppose, that they would get bored now and then, and what can we do to stir things up a little bit besides some of the things you could write about, like Gray Barker played up the straight letter to the hilt in his publication, and Jim did also.
Oh no, I've been silenced. I can't talk about that. In the early 50s, this George Adamski, who you've heard of, right? The leading UFO contactee of the early period. He wrote 3 books altogether with flying saucers in the title.
He claimed that on November 20th, 1952, in the desert of Southern California, he saw a flying saucer land, and he talked with its occupant, a Venusian named Orthon. Adamski's claims accelerated from there. He wrote a total of 3 books on his adventures with friendly space people. He claimed that he had flown around the moon in a flying saucer. Toward the end of his life, he actually claimed that in 1962 he'd boarded a flying saucer and actually gone to Venus and spent a few hours on the Venusian surface.
I knew a lot about his claims and didn't believe them, and of course Gray Barker didn't believe them, but he probably pretended to, because he pretended to believe everything. So one night in Clarksburg in 1957, I think, we got drunk and we had some stationery that we got from a Gray Barker fan whose father was high in the State Department.
Gray Barker and Jim Moseley, along with a guy named Jim Villard, thought this was hilarious. And so they decided that they were going to take this claim of Adamski's and use it to hoax Adamski. Now, this is grossly illegal. But Villard is young and foolish. Brings letterheads from the State Department and other agencies of the U.S. government to Barker and Moseley.
I can't make this. Department of State, Washington. This is a copy of the Straith letter here. And it was a blank form, blank sheet of paper with the letterhead. And that they put it in Gray's typewriter and typed out this letter that essentially is addressed to George Adamski, and stating that George Adamski was right about everything he was saying.
From the State Department in Washington, Professor George Adamski. While certainly the department cannot publicly confirm your experiences, it can, I believe, with propriety, encourage your work and your communication of what you sincerely believe should be told to our American public. Sincerely, R.E. Straith, Cultural Exchange Committee.
The one with the State Department heading, we used to write this letter to Adamski, in which a State Department official named R.E. Straith, who never existed, was telling Professor Adamski, as he called himself, that there are those of us here at the State Department, even though we can't come out publicly and admit it, but we have, faith in your claims, and we know you're on the right track. And
Adamski gets this letter, and I don't know whether he knew it was a hoax or what he was thinking, but he trumpeted it immediately. He went to the papers with it. It was a big story. And for years and years and years, and even now, you'll find Adamski supporters saying, this is proof that the U.S. government knew about and supported Adamski's work with the Venusians.
The government, of course, heard about this, and they got angry, and they came to him and said, this letter is a fake, stop using it to promote yourself, and then he did it all the more, as probably anyone would, because he had no knowledge that it was a fake, and he wouldn't have probably cared if he had known. And the FBI and some other government agency got involved in investigating this, and they did visit Gray Barker.
Later on, they got really scared that the U.S. government was going to come and find out where these letters came from, and they would be in very serious violation of federal law. So Barker had the typewriter on which the letter was written destroyed and actually put inside a wall. The remnants were sealed inside a wall.
Somewhere you will find the remnants of this typewriter if you tear down enough walls.
He had made himself enough of a presence that you couldn't pretend that Gray Barker wasn't there, because he was always meddling in something.
Those of the people who have seen The Mothman Prophecies with Richard Gere will see the phone call portrayed very differently. In the original book, The Mothman Prophecies, John Keel, late at night, receives a strange call from Gray Barker. And Gray Barker acts as though he is like a robot, that he's speaking strangely, as if he doesn't really know John Keel.
John Keel wrote about the Mothman Prophecies, another one of the great West Virginia monsters that Gray Barker exploited. From my conversations with Barker, I had the impression that his private beliefs about the meaning of actual UFO phenomena is pretty similar to John Keel's, that it was really a kind of primitive demonology. Keel immersed himself in it. Barker didn't. I just think that Barker thought, yeah, this makes sense, but I'm not going to think too deeply about it.
On July 15, 1967, Keel called me at my office and cautiously referred to our phone conversation from the past night. I detected something was wrong from the tone of his voice and figured he had been the victim of a strange phone call involving me. When I denied making the call, he gave me the details.
Keel is kind of frightened by this, and he feels as though he might not really be talking to the real Gray Barker. It's a very strange episode in the book, and it is so strange and so dramatic in the book that the author, the scriptwriter for the Mothman Prophecies film, felt he needed to jazz it up a little bit. So he makes the phone call come to Mr. Klein, which is Mr. Keel, actually altered slightly. But the call doesn't come from Gray Barker, who's not a character in the movie at all, but it comes from Indrid Cold, who is this bizarre entity from some other dimension or maybe outer space or somewhere. The basis for the entire episode in the movie is, of course, the call from Gray Barker.
My grandmother was always kind of superstitious, and maybe those thoughts come to him through her, you know, at one time. But I don't know whether he believed in the flying saucers or not, UFOs. I really don't know. But he sure was interested in it. He walked from where he lived at Riffle, I don't know how many miles it was, maybe 5 miles across the hill, and came over to the Lloyd property and caught the school bus going to Sutton High School. He read all the time, and of course they had kerosene lamps. They didn't have gas, and his eyesight in later years wasn't too good.
He came up out of poverty and apparently was a genius of some sort, and he got his way into college, which I think he was the only one in his family that ever went to college. And he graduated and became an English teacher for a year. And then after that went on into the film business.
We have photographs of him before most of this happened. We have a nice picture of Barker in his teens sitting on his front porch, reading Esquire magazine in the rocking chair. And so you can see him as one of those people. It's part of the revolt from the village, which in the history of American literature happened a generation earlier, but things do happen later in West Virginia because the modern world got here a little bit later.
He was really interested in film, and he had worked at the drive-in in Weston, in Lewis County, and then at the theater in Clarksburg. And I think that he ran a little film business himself with porno films available to men's groups.
Just one of the great shows we're going to have, for instance, we're going to have Clint Eastwood and Magnum Force, and let's see, we're going to have maybe Deep Throat Part 2, and a lot of fine pictures like that, a lot of fine family pictures like Walt Disney. And
he was a motion picture distributor. He was the agent for about 30 drive-ins in that section of West Virginia at its peak.
When I knew him before he was in the flying saucer business, he was post-schoolmaster and was running drive-in movie bookings and was doing a big thing doing early Marilyn Monroe movies. Gray was finding early stuff that Marilyn was in for like 2 minutes, and you could rent them for $10 a night. And Gray was renting these real cheap movies and renting them to the drive-ins, and they were packing them. And he was actually making a very good living doing reruns on Bowery Boys and Marilyn Monroe bit part movies. And he did this with other people who reached to stardom. Gray would do his research and would find the cheapest rentals possible, sometimes in which, say, Paul Newman was literally the spear carrier and would run it as the Paul Newman special. And he would absolutely fill the drive-ins.
And he loved science fiction, and most of all, monster movies and Halloween and all sorts of things that were scary and different and that made people alarmed in one way or another. And of course, flying saucers fit perfectly into that category.
Now, this is a devil picture. You see, everyone is interested in exorcism now. And the Lovis Weston Drive-In is having a picture on exorcism. And I understand that this is a case where maybe even exorcism can't help.
He used to take it to the drive-in. You take all that kid to the drive-in. And he loved scary stuff, Gray did. He liked monsters and stuff.
That was our best vacation on weekends. Getting to see our Uncle Gray come and take us to a fantastic movie or talk and sit and tell ghost stories. He loved to tell ghost stories also.
He would dress up, and try to scare us, peek through the windows and stuff, try to scare us. And he done all kinds of stuff like that with us. He'd come in on weekends and he'd dress up like Hitler, and put a cape on, and he'd go around the house and hide money, and and had a big baton. He'd raise that baton up and down whenever we got close to money so we could find the money. But he kept us, we always look forward, to his visits.
At the office. And this is Gray when he stood around outside.
Every time I would turn around, it was flying saucers. He would write books. I could hear my aunt and them discussing about how they know too much. He went to the place there in Flatwoods where they had the monster, where they appeared. He went and investigated that.
I remember this one. I run pages through this one. I run pages through this one on a mimeograph machine. Just let them run through pages after pages.
All right, before I get started, second the commercial. I sell books. I have a newsletter on UFOs and other related and unrelated happenings. If you want a catalog, go back to where Mr. Taylor is and he'll give you a free catalog. We take MasterCard and Visa orders.
He was a source for me of copies of Project Blue Book Special Report 14, a very serious volume. And he published it, and I would buy many at a time. And he was always accommodating. And so I came to trust him as a reliable supplier. And I felt that he did everything carefully and sensibly and so forth. So I know he had his wilder side with Jim Moseley and so forth. And I know that he and James Moseley cooked up a phony letter and a Straith letter and so forth as a fun sort of thing. And I don't much care for phony letters about anything, but still, I won't hold that against Gray. I'll blame it on Moseley.
I think that Gray was motivated by a legitimate curiosity at the time. And certainly in the 50s, he was not alone. He just happened to be the one who was perhaps more successful than other writers at the time in getting his material into print. Certainly Gray was the most prolific and most successful UFO author in the 1950s.
First of all, we want to greet the spaceman that is here among us that looks just like us. We also want to greet the FBI man who is here to secretly take notes.
He had a huge following from the very early 1950s when he first came out with his Saucerian publication right after the Flatwoods Monster in 1952. He started advertising and some of the science fiction magazines because there were very, very few UFO publications then.
At his peak, I'm sure he had 2,000 or 3,000 or more people that were subscribing to that in the 50s. And through that, of course, he sold his books. So he did very well for a while.
And I might as well take this opportunity to release this particular information, which I was going to bring out in the forthcoming newsletter which I publish.
It started off, he did it on a ditto machine, which is a spirit duplicate, little purple stains on a page is what it amounts to, hardly readable at all. And it just gradually grew the way that some science fiction fanzines would grow.
He collected and wrote about all kinds of fringe and bizarre, strange, outlandish stuff that the more serious publishers of UFO bulletins were ignoring as beneath their dignity.
He was a master at writing these incidents up, these cases. And he would seemingly, he would get all the details right, the times, the dates, etc. And he would have this color that he would infuse into all of his writings.
You read the Saussure and you really get a sense of the kind of social movement that was growing up around the idea of flying saucers from other worlds. You began to understand the personalities, the beliefs, the claims. Anybody who is trying to reconstruct the social history of the flying saucer movement has to read the Saussurian.
We were going to look for good science fiction writing and for good writing, mythological and fantastic writing that was not in the sci-fi vein. By the end of the third issue, Gray was saying, no more of these, it doesn't suit my public. And after that, he would rewrite all the stuff himself. It was written, he wanted people who believed everything that was going, and I think that was his downfall.
Most of his fans that subscribed to his magazine, because the magazine was so wild, he catered almost completely to what would we call the contactee wing of the saucer field, or the fringe wing, the people who were pretty far out.
Tape number CS3, Music from Another Planet by Howard Menger.
I am Howard Menger. The following statements, which I shall make, are true facts. The music that has been recorded on the reverse side of this record has come to me from outer space.
Here they are. Barker's files about Howard Menger. I was hoping to find correspondence, but there's no exchange of letters here. And that's surprising because Barker published a manuscript of Menger's.
Howard Menger was a sign painter, lived on a farm in New Jersey. And beginning in 1957, in that general time frame, 56, he supposedly began observing Venusian spaceships landing on his farm.
I have had direct contact with people from other planets and have spoken with them on many occasions. I have ridden in their spaceships. They have taken me to their planets and brought me back to Earth again several times.
Menger hooked up with Barker. Menger actually got a fair amount of press, particularly on the East Coast. And so he came to the attention of contactee-oriented flying saucer buffs. Barker published in 1959 Menger's book, From Outer Space to You, which is about Menger's adventures with Venusians, his trip to the moon. There's actually a photograph of the moon's surface and a flying saucer that he apparently took out of the porthole of a spaceship that he was on.
I think what really got Gray involved in that aspect of the UFO mystery was going out to Giant Rock, California, because starting in, I believe, 1954, a contactee, a man named George Van Tassel, who was a native Ohioan and who had worked in the aerospace industry before and after World War II, bought a little airport near 29 Palms in California called Giant Rock.
Barker was part of the Saussurian movement. The Saussurian movement was really a kind of quasi-religious movement based on kind of a hodgepodge of bizarre and extraordinary claims, occult beliefs, both modern and traditional, and incredibly unbelievable experiential claims of communications with Venusians and Martians and so on.
He got to meet a lot of these people, and he made contacts with them, and they would do articles for him, and he would write about them, and his readers were obviously interested enough that he kept it up. And Gray always, covered that particular part of the UFO scene, the contactees.
I know it's an UFO writing, and falls into one of those middle categories where it's playing to its audience, which means it's entertainment, not literature, and at the same time it's presented as fact rather than as fiction, as if you were writing for people who didn't live in a society where fiction existed. Fiction, that's just made up. I want facts, like these facts about the sexy saucer people, which is naive.
When Gray maybe crossed the line, he would do so maybe in the manner of personalities, or maybe personalities pertaining to the contactee movement. Maybe he would put too much, stock into what they were saying and put it forth as fact. That's, I think, his greatest misdemeanor.
He was very taken by fantasy and science fiction and the sense of wonderment that one gets from things that are designed to scare you and entertain you, but which are not really seriously considered to be true.
Barker's hero had always been Ray Palmer. Palmer was this strange character who was a magazine editor for the pulps back in the 30s and 40s, and he edited science fiction magazines. He was the guy who promoted the Shaver mystery, which sort of predated the UFO age by a few years.
But Ray Palmer was smart enough, savvy enough to know that when he got manuscripts from Richard Shaver about this other world, that he shouldn't just publish them as science fiction. He should take them seriously and present them with a question mark. Is this real? Is this real? He kept asking the questions until people took up the cry and made a big deal out of it.
I did have extensive correspondence from Shaver at a later period of time after Gray asked me to do a series on the Shaver magazine, the Shaver Mystery. We had a correspondence, and one became apparent as this thing went on, but Palmer was distorting constantly. But that Shaver was very, very sincere about what he was doing, and that Palmer was frequently not even letting him know what kind of evidence was going to be published in the next installment. And he himself was giving things to Palmer he was not getting back the next time around. On the other hand, Palmer was claiming that Shaver had been writing him threatening letters, which is how he happened to rewrite him to begin with. Shaver had not arrived as a literary figure, but as an escapee from the caverns who was convinced Palmer knew about them, and he was threatening to exterminate him. Palmer led him on, according to Gray's story, to become a really notable writer. Indeed.
He's the one that came out with the Dero story. The Deros, the degenerate race of people from thousands of years ago that live underground and attack the minds of Earth people and try to drive them crazy. Well, Richard Shaver, that wrote that stuff, was crazy, so he should have known a lot more than most people about the Deros.
It was not until later he found out that Shaver had actually been incarcerated in a mental institution during a part of the time he claimed to have been incarcerated in the caverns. I think Gray, in the end, he wasn't going to publish this, and I guess I realize now it's because not because he didn't want to embarrass Shaver, but because he didn't want to embarrass Ray Palmer. He really enjoyed the circus Palmer was putting on.
He was the model for guys like Barker, who wanted to take the weird stuff, the bizarre claims, the strange beliefs, the wild stories, and market them. And maybe on another level, just enjoy them for what they were, as a kind of modern folklore.
I have to think, one of the things that I know when I was publishing my fanzine, I was a geek in high school and nobody took me seriously, but the moment I started publishing my own fanzine, people took me seriously. I was somebody that was doing something, you know, I had an idea, and I can see this in Gray too. By publishing, he legitimized what he was doing, he legitimized his interests, and in a sense, his byline is creating himself. By putting it in the magazine, he's becoming this character, Gray Barker, as opposed to this person, Gray Barker.
He thought of himself as a storyteller, not a historian, not a scientist, not even a serious writer, I don't think.
He had great ideas, which other people have now turned into major productions. Gray could have written his own Men in Black if he had just had a little, but he couldn't. He was too far into the thing. He was part of the hoax. He could no longer sit back with one hand and watch the dog and monkey show being played out before him on the stage. It's sad. It's really sad. But other people have had to do the work rather than he himself. And on the other hand, due to the fact he did do this, the really serious research he accumulated will not be taken seriously either.
No matter how much of a living Gray was able to pull out of this, he's never going to see the money that's been generated by things like the Mothman Prophecies, Men in Black, Philadelphia Experiment, and even whatever he contributed to the creation of something like the X-Files and inspiring that. I mean, all of these things are out there making big money, and it's all because of his insight, his taste.
You know, somebody in his behalf should have asked, I don't think they would have got it, some kind of a monetary credit there. In a way, did he invent it or he just publicized it? But the term Men in Black certainly comes from Gray Barker.
I got back to Clarksburg early and drove around town. I decided to alter usual tactics and frequent the low pool rooms and cafes on Pike Street. I had a glass of beer and looked around. Nobody was around who looked young enough to be indoctrinated with left-wing propaganda. In fact, the men at the bar drinking beer had a definite John Birch aura about them.
He wrote these straightforward accounts of what was going on in his life, but he sent them out in the mail and represented them instead of letters or diaries. He put cover letters on them that said, "This is a work of fiction." It was a draft for a chapter in a novel to be called Mulberry Place, and they circulated as fictions. And as fictions, of course, there was no legal problem. I mean, goodness knows, in 1961 or 62, you could write a novel in which people, picked up men on the streets of Clarksburg in the dead of night. After all, it was fiction. So after writing quite a lot of fiction and presenting it as fact in UFO, he wrote factual accounts of his life and distributed them through the mails as fiction. It's an awfully nice parallel.
Back then you didn't talk about gay, people being gay, but now he kept his private life, yeah. I don't even think my aunt knowed. And there was some issues, I guess he had got in trouble there in Clarksburg with some of the some of the boys. I don't know. It was, before my time, or maybe I was just growing up and didn't realize it. But yeah, he was very private. I didn't learn nothing of the gayness till after his death.
He did at one time have a court-appointed psychiatrist who was to help him deal with this. And I'd like to know more about that. Unfortunately, it's a generation later, and the court-appointed psychiatrist is gone, and Mr. Barker's gone, and the judge who appointed the psychiatrist is gone, and it's a little late to ask how that all went. I imagine Barker told his psychiatrist what he thought he wanted to hear.
He was very quiet, and he was almost a recluse, and I didn't meet many people who knew him very well. It's just that the proper church-going community had branded him as an outcast, and the rest of the community just sort of went along with it.
That was not an easy life at that time. We tend to, it's kind of like the Betty and Barney Hill case, a black man and a white woman. Now today we sort of take this sort of thing for granted. But when the television movie was on in 1975, it was the first time ever black man and white woman in bed. They were talking, there was nothing going on. But that tells you how much our society has changed. And being a gay man was not a popular position to be in back then. So I have a great deal of respect for people who could handle that, so to speak, because I think it must be awfully difficult not to try to live up to your true nature, not to have to worry about it, whether it's your sex life or your UFO interest, either way.
I always felt he should have left West Virginia and gone up to New York. If he'd gone to New York City, even in those days, somewhere like Greenwich Village or what have you, he wouldn't have stood out at all, and he could have been more relaxed and not have such a legal problem hovering over him as he did. But he was psychologically afraid to leave the state. It was like leaving the womb or something.
Certainly Barker had a tremendous secret that he had to keep with his sexual orientation. So my guess is that for Barker, the idea that there is something so explosive that it cannot be revealed, and that if you speak about it, you get into trouble, was something that echoed for him.
And he would describe meeting someone that he found attractive, and he would describe that person as being interesting from the standpoint of UFO research. So he wasn't just a hoaxer, he was a wit. And it's an open question to what extent he used UFOs simply as a way of establishing himself as a person who might suitably lead a gay life in a small town. Maybe that's part of the pattern. Maybe that kind of marginal life requirement requires you to develop something about yourself that sets you apart from other people and gives you an acceptable label. It's not an insulting label. That's Gray Barker, the UFO guy. Oh yes, he knows all about that. And if you're only allowed, one paragraph, a brief paragraph that's your tag in small town life, it's better to have the UFO tag than the dangerous sodomite tag.
He had a sensitivity about him for other people, and I don't see that in most people in this field. They don't have it. They're just in it for themselves and want as much as they can get out of it. But Gray, he had fun with it.
Barker was a complicated man. You can't just shove him into a little box and keep him there.
Gray Barker was probably the victim and the joker and the clever researcher, all mixed into one.
In some way, he was like, the traditional storyteller in the rural community who kept the beliefs and the stories, the legends, the customs alive, and which otherwise might have just died out and been forgotten.
We lost a giant in the field. There will never be another Gray Barker, another promoter, another writer like he was, who had that sense of awe and wonder.
Maybe it's a story of a guy who outlived his time. That there was a time for Gray Barker in the 1950s and 1960s, and then it was over. And he didn't know what else to do with his life.
He drug it out. And they were the pictures I had seen in 1953 and 55, but not told at all with the old glint in the eye or the extra ad-libs that made every Gray Barker narration a little different and also interesting, different from the one before it. Always something new to be added, different perspective to be thrown in, half mocking. No, this was a true believer who was not a true believer. It was a tired man. It was like a whiskey priest who had lost his faith.
What is it that makes you become friends with one person and not another, you know? We just got along very nice and had a lot of fun together. And we both drank and smoked. I still drink and smoke. He quit.
It was clear that he was a deeply unhappy man. You didn't have to know him well to get that sense. And that he was wrestling with something, you know, personal demons that were really none of your business, so you didn't inquire. When he died, nobody really knew what the cause of death was, and so it was just sort of assumed that maybe through unhappiness he just drunk so much that he had, you know, died by alcohol, suicide by alcohol, something like that. Nobody knew about AIDS in those days, maybe some medical scientists. But it wasn't a word or a concept or a disease that was widely known.
Mosley thinks he died of AIDS, so I don't know. And at that time, there wasn't much discussion of AIDS in this state. And so, you know, you don't die of AIDS, you die because you can't fight other diseases.
There are two aspects of Gray. There was this one aspect of Gray that really wanted to believe that all this was happening and who was indeed fascinated by it all. And there was other more cynical side of Gray.
Gray had reached that kind of a stage in his career. I'm sorry for that. Still, there's some lines Yeats wrote once. When mind harks back on the generous things that he did, why, I grow half contented to have been blind. And I sort of think with Gray as well. I remember the generous things that he did. And not the things, do the rest of Yeats. I thought him half a lunatic, half knave, and told him so, but friendship never ends. And when I think back on the generous things that he did, why, I'd grow half contented to be blind.
Late in life, he seems, at least in certain moods, to have regretted ever having gotten involved with UFO. You can always read Barker's poem, UFO is a bucket of shit.
UFO is a bucket of shit. Its followers, perverts, monomaniacs, dipsomaniacs, artists of the fast buck. Shushed by the three men or masturbated by spacemen. UFO is a bucket of shit. The AF investigated UFO and issued a report, couched in polite language, which translated means UFO is a bucket of shit. And I sit here, writing, while the shit drips down my face in great rivulets.
I hope that if you all haven't seen a flying saucer, that eventually you will see one. If you haven't seen one, my advice would be not to look for them in outer space or even in another dimension, into the oceans or not even in the hollow earth. But the next time you go outside on a starry night and you do not see any UFOs, I guarantee you this, if you look deep inside yourself, there you will see them. Good night.
I am a poor traveling through this world of war. There's no sickness, toil, or danger in that bright land to where I go. I'm going there to see my father. I'm going there, no more to roam. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home. I know dark clouds will gather